We do have a lot to cover this morning, so we will get started. But first, hi, my name is Angela. I am the Education and Scholarly Communication Specialist here at the library, and today we will be talking about posters. Um, so, first, jumping in is the session overview. We'll spend the bulk of our time talking about the effective design and presenting portions of the poster session. The other parts of the presentation we'll kind of gloss over very quickly, but they are available online through the library's library guide. So brief introduction slash scenario. It kind of depends. You can change undergraduate research symposium to literally anything else that you might need a research poster for. But I just want to share with you before we get started, my first experience as a poster presenter was pretty awful. I had started working at a smaller library, and one of my tasks early on was to do a poster presentation for a grant funded conference. And the librarian who had been there prior to me had given me some advice. She's like, just put some slides on a poster board. You're going to be fine. Everybody does it at this one. It's very low key. Okay, that was cool. I thought I can do that. So it felt wrong after having been a graduate of tech. I'm like, there's no way that this is legitimate. But it 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 was like, okay, we're just gonna go with what they tell me. I hadn't been there for very long, so I didn't really know the project very well either. And I did all of these things that they said, put the posters, put the pictures up on slides, put them onto a poster board. And I went to the poster session, and I was literally the only person who did that. Everybody else had these really professionally well-designed things. Um, and I didn't. And then not only was it super embarrassing because I didn't have the right thing, but then when talking about the project, I didn't know the project well enough to answer a lot of the questions. So, needless to say, I came back to Michigan feeling like a failure and also very determined to never ever have that happen again. So, you guys are going to kind of reap the benefits of all of the work that I did to make sure that that doesn't happen again. And we're going to talk a lot about how to do poster sessions. Poster sessions in general feel very overwhelming sometimes. Depending on the size of the session, you can walk into this massive room and there are just hundreds of posters everywhere. So you're kind of competing not only for attention in terms of who you want to stop by, but you're also just trying to stand out in a big crowd of people and get your work noticed. And that's really important. So, diving in, let's talk a little bit about the audience and the context. When we think about posters, we need to consider who is going to be at a poster session. So, for audience, generally you have experts and non-experts. So you might have people who are regularly in the field, but then you might have the occasional spouse of somebody who is in the field who's also at the conference. You might have an undergrad who's just coming in who doesn't really know. You might have an administrator from a different university who's just kind of wandering through checking things out. There's really no specific, attendance at a conference, as you probably know. And the other thing that might happen is that you may have people from different funding organizations or stakeholders for the projects that you're doing. They may be funding multiple projects and they want to come and see who all is doing what with their money. And then thinking about the goals at a poster session or really any conference, but mostly when you're in a poster session, you want to kind of take in a lot of information. It's a really great way to get a lot of information all at once because there generally are so many posters there. Network because it's a one-on-one conversation. And then to just be inspired. There's a lot of really great research out there. There's a lot of fantastic projects, and there's a lot of really cool posters. So looking at the content, the there are a couple of standard but not required sections that usually come with a poster. It also depends on the layout that you pick, and we'll talk a little bit more about layout as we go. Um, Double check your conference information because they may require you to have different things on your poster. They may require a specific format. They may require a different specific section. Some of them require everything that's on the list behind me, and then some require absolutely nothing, and they're just very relaxed. It really just depends. Overall, though, thinking about posters, they are very visual in nature, and you want to be concise. So remember, as you are designing your poster, people are walking by. They're not standing like we are here or sitting like we are here in a room, able to sit for a long period of time and read. They have a lot that they want to get through, and they want to get through it very quickly. So being concise is really important. Do not copy and paste from any of your papers and just throw it on there. Um, that's so much information for someone to get through, and it's not easily digestible, right? So if you think of a research paper, the research paper's medium is specifically written for someone who has the time to sit, relax, kind of work through all of that information and really digest it and take it in. A poster session is much faster. So you don't have that kind of time. You have 100+ posters to get through, and you have like an hour to do it. So it's not a great deal of time to get through. Um, Represent your information visually where you can. So thinking about what we just said about not putting your paper onto your poster, take a few minutes to think about where you can take options where you don't need words to describe something, but you can use a graph or a chart, an image, a picture, anything that you can to kind of display the information in a much more easily digestible manner for people who are strolling by your poster. And thinking of that, use your words and your visuals to really highlight one or two main points that you would like to focus on. What is the story that your research is trying to tell folks as they're walking by? And it can really be any section. It doesn't have to come from the conclusions. So thinking about it, you can have something really interesting happen during the beginning phase of your project. Maybe you discovered a new methodology. Maybe you're trying a little bit of different type of research. It doesn't have to come from the conclusion or the results section all of the time. It could be any main component that is really interesting to you. And then thinking also, a note on visuals, make sure that the visuals you do use, your charts, your images, that those are also clear, that they are high quality images because you will be printing these, right? They need to be concisely labeled. And that concise labeling, you don't want to have like a whole big chunk of information underneath your graph to describe your graph. If you need that much language to describe your image is failing, right? It's not supporting what it needs to be doing without a ton of explanation. So you're better off just putting the words. You want to make sure that everything is concise, well labeled, and clear. So readability is the next consideration for effective poster design. For the most part, your poster needs to be visible from about 6 feet away. And that's primarily because people, when you're in a poster session, they don't come right up to you immediately. A lot of times there are people in front of you. There's a big line of people trying to pass through that hallway, and they're just really trying to see. It's kind of like when you go to a restaurant and you're viewing a menu from a distance. You're not quite ready. You're not sure if you want to approach just yet. So you take a look, you're squinting, kind of reading, that looks good. And then you approach kind of similar at a poster session. People stand back, they tend to read, look through different things before finally deciding we're going to approach. So with that in mind, your poster should have some contrasting but pleasant colors, nothing neon. Neon is very hard on the eyes. It's interesting, but it's really hard to read. Consider your white space and clear separation of content. Generally using a sans serif font, and then listed on the slide are the sizes that you would use most commonly. And then a poster size itself is generally about 36 inches by 48 inches. And make sure that when you are designing your poster, you set your slide sizes first. Always set them first to make sure that you have the correct scale before you go to print. In keeping with our thought of readability, we also want to consider the flow or the arrangement of our poster. Remember, we're in a Western country, so we start reading from left to right, top to bottom. So through that kind of arrangement, there is what's called a reading gravity, which is a line that starts from the upper left and then goes all the way down to the bottom right. You want to make sure that the most important information is placed along that line of gravity. People are going to be looking at those points. And obviously, if you were in a different country where the reading gravity was opposite, you would want to consider that for your audience. Thinking about clear labels, which we already talked a little bit about, these are really critical if you're going to use a non-standard layout, which we'll talk a little bit more about layout in a second. If you're using headings, different visuals, like I said, you want to make sure that everything is concise and clear. So we're going to do a quick activity since there are people here this morning. I'm so excited. We'll do a quick activity, and what I want folks to look for is what works and what does not work in the following examples. So there are 3 different posters that we have, and they're all interesting in their own way. Keep an eye out for things like flow, the images that they use, the arrangement, how they use white space, color, font, size, and consistency. So here's our first poster. I'm taking just a couple of seconds to take this all in. What is one of the first things that is noticeable about this piece? Yeah. It's really hard to read. It's very, very dense, right? So if we look at this poster, not only is it very dense, what else is kind of wrong with it? Yeah. Right. So the results in the discussion are kind of in a weird spot in terms of your reading gravity. So thinking about it, I mean, they do have it clearly marked, right? They do have introduction, procedure, results, conclusions. But the way that it's arranged or the flow just doesn't work for what we're doing. The other thing I would probably note is if you look at the descriptions of the actual images, there's a lot of text. In the most cases on this particular poster, the amount of text almost is as same as or larger than the actual image itself. So it's not an effective image if you have to have that much information. So let's look at the next slide. And again, what maybe works a little bit differently here. And I'm actually going to turn on the ceiling microphones to hopefully hear you guys a little bit better. So what works for this one in comparison to the one we just looked at? Yeah.
There's a lot more white space that's kind of spread out a bit more.
There's a lot more white space, so it's spread out a lot more. Yep. Anything else that anyone notices that works for it? What about like the color? It's not bad, right? Color's not bad. And then they do have a clear title too, so that helps. You can see if you think about the one that we just looked at, look how tiny the title is, and the authors are all listed underneath. And the universities are all listed underneath, which is pretty standard operating procedure, but it's also small that it's hard to read. We look at this one, it's a little bit clearer. We can see the author still, we have a clear title, and at the bottom, we have her contact information, which is really nice. What does not work for this poster though? Yeah.
They broke phase 2 and phase 3. I would want those phases all together in one
Yes.
block.
Yes, so they broke the results and discussion in kind of a weird arrangement, and they just kind of, if you can't really see it on this slide here, but on the regular slides, the backgrounds are even two different colors. So they look like they're two different, totally different things. The only other thing that I would say for this one is, other than it being a little bit text heavy, the experimental setup has some imagery that's a little bit wonky. There's a lot of arrows in that tiny diagram that might be better served by having a clearer visual there. So let's look at this one. What works for this poster and what does not work for this poster? And just as a side note, the tiny writing in the bottom corner is acknowledgements, research permission, and research funding notes. So what's working or not working? Yeah.
I like the map and the big flower in the background, but the overall yellow and red is kind of hard for me to read personally.
So right, I would agree there. I would have maybe made it a slightly different color yellow, just for readability. But I appreciate very much that the author of this poster tried to carry through the colors that are natural to the item that they're looking at, right? So you have the trout lily, and then all of the colors match everything. Even in terms of like the anther colors that she uses match the top flower, which I thought was kind of clever. What else would you guys say about this poster? Yeah.
There's not a lot of context for the graphics. Like there's some, but I feel like I don't really understand like the methods that well.
Right. So I actually emailed this person before using her poster, because I was kind of curious how people in her classes have taken this. So she's used this in her own work. And she said it's usually hit or miss with students. Some people really love it, and then other people are like, where are the standard sections? And so, yeah, I agree. It's hard to determine kind of the methodology. And that's one of those things where maybe at the poster session, she would have been able to answer. But you do leave your posters up afterward, right? So if you're gone, how can people ask you those questions? So that is one thing that I would say that is kind of a critique on this poster, for sure. I do, though, like that she asks the title as a question, and then her visuals answer the question. So you have 4 clear main points that she's trying to give you before coming to the conclusion at the bottom. So thinking of that, in the layouts and the structure of posters, we just saw 2 very traditionally styled posters and then one kind of traditional poster. But there are different types of layouts. So there's a bunch of different templates that you can use. We do have one link to our library guide that we'll talk about. But you can pretty much go anywhere and look for those. Double check your conference or symposium rules though, again, just to make sure they don't require a specific layout. One thing I will say is that you are not bound to a horizontal configuration. So if your conference rules don't have a limitation, you can turn them vertically and there's no rule against that. And it stands out, it looks a little bit different. It really just depends on your personal preference and how you want to do it. There are so we looked at the traditional ones, and then we also have a style called the better poster, or what some people are calling poster 2.0. Better poster was something that was created by a Michigan State PhD student quite recently. He has a background in graphic design, I believe. His name is Mike Morrison. And he found evidence that shows that a much more visual style of poster is something that is not only more attention getting during a poster session, but that the visuals really decrease the amount of what he called cognitive load. So the amount of processing time that it takes for a person to look at a poster, digest what's on there, and then be able to ask questions. So it's really kind of an interesting concept to think of. And to show you, we have the two layouts here. So the traditional layout is a template that I kind of modified from Wayne State University's poster templates and their LibGuides. For something like this, what I'm really looking to highlight here isn't necessarily the amount of text that's on it, but just that the title is across the top and that you generally have usually 3 or 4 columns underneath outlining your work. The better poster, this is actually, I think, the second version of the better poster. He has like 4 different styles on there. So as you can see, a little bit more infographic-y in terms of style, but something that is very visual and very, I don't know, it's kind of interesting. It's a very different take on a research paper or research poster. There are people who are a little bit critical of the design and have modified it to be kind of a hybrid between the two styles to add a little bit more context or information. And then there are people who are just super not into it. And they call it gimmicky and a little bit of like, this isn't what we were looking for. So again, personal preference, I think, but I also strongly believe personally that your poster style is changing because the way that we intake and ingest information has changed quite a bit in the last like 10 or 15 years. There's a lot more visual emphasis when we do things on our phones. So it makes sense that our research posters might want to start reflecting that. Looking at presentations, like the actual presentation part, is not like what we're doing here today. If you've never been to a poster presentation, you pretty much stand in a large room that has been emptied out, and all of the posters are up behind you, either on easels or tables. And you stand off to the side of your poster. You need to be, as the slide says, friendly, confident, polite. Introduce yourself. And you don't want to stand kind of right in front or in the middle of, stand off to the side so folks can see. But maybe more importantly is to be brief, have an elevator pitch ready to go. Make that elevator pitch about 2 minutes-ish. Anything longer than that, people don't have time for. They have, like I said, generally 100+ posters to get through and usually about an hour to get through them. And just allow people to take a minute and ask questions. Like I said, they might stand back for a while, either until you're done talking with someone or until they have a question. And then think also about the level of jargon or technical language that you want to use when speaking with someone. I think the biggest difference for posters is that they're audience driven. So what I'm doing here is presenter driven, right? I've determined the information that I felt was important for you to know, and now I'm giving it back to you. In a poster presentation or poster session, the audience determines what they want to know. So you can have all of this really great research behind you, and they'll come up and say, can you explain this graph to me a little bit? And that might be the only question they ask of you. They might ask you something related, but not quite to the project. They might ask you something that you didn't work on. And so that's why it's really important to make sure that you know and understand your research inside and out, right? So you will get a wide variety of perspectives. One of the last conferences that I presented at, I went to San Diego, and there was the funding agency had sent over people from the archives, the museum, the library, and administration kind of areas of their federal agency. And I had to be able to field questions from all different perspectives. I wouldn't have been able to do that. And I knew that I wasn't able to do that if I didn't know my project inside and out. Because remember, when I first started, I had a very similar situation and I didn't know. So it's really imperative that you know the information. The other thing that's really disappointing is when you get to a poster session and you ask a question and that person says, well, my teammate actually would know that, I don't. So that means they have to make the decision to come back. And most of the time, they're not going to come back. They're just going to move forward. So the last part of the actual presentation thing to consider is supplemental information. Think about maybe bringing your business card if you have, or a handout if there's a little bit more that doesn't quite fit on your poster. You can also create a link or a QR code to your paper, to a website that you've created on the project that would give people a little bit more of a full experience. So for the second half, we'll skim through here. And we'll talk some about the resources that are available to you. All of the resources that are on here are linked in the library's research poster guide on the library's website. Some common poster designing tools are listed on the screen. What I think personally the most common one that I've seen used is PowerPoint. It's also probably, to me, the easiest. If you have a good basis in PowerPoint or you kind of know Microsoft, it's not hard to figure out PowerPoint. In fact, the library has even created a very basic PowerPoint template on the guide that you can use. It's already set up to the actual dimensions. All you need to do is input your information. You don't have to follow the templates exactly. So feel free to add whatever you want and kind of make everything visually interesting and stand out a little bit differently. So a couple of tricks that you can do, just showing how to get to that if you want to start from scratch. And then also how to use text and image boxes to help align things. Another fun resource is canva.com. Canva is really great. I don't know how many people are familiar with it. Free, drag and drop. Obviously, for those of you nodding your head, you know that some of the options then are paid. You have to have an account to sign up. But what's nice about Canva is if you decide to use that, it does have a QR code generator in the kind of the extra pieces, and that's something that's free for you to use. You don't have to pay for that. So if you're thinking about leaning to a more visual style of a poster, you can link a QR code through that pretty easily. So again, some tricks. Images for you to use are freely available on places like Pixabay, Wikimedia Commons. or you can try using advanced Google searching to limit images labeled for reuse or open access. You can create tables using these tools that are listed on the slide. Just note that some of them, like Canva, easel.ly, and Pictochart, do require some paid accounts or paid parts. And in thinking of images, a quick, very general note on copyright. Generally, you cannot use an image or chart or anything that you have not created if you do not have permission. So you either need to ask permission or make sure that that image or chart or whatever is licensed under open access, public domain, or any sort of similar Creative Commons licensing. Because the last thing you want to do is to get into trouble for using someone else's research. Thinking about color very quickly, we want to use pleasant but contrasting color schemes, and it might be important to consider color blindness and accessibility. So there are two different tools that are listed on this slide that have color blind accessible color palettes. And if you're just really not creatively inclined, there are other websites that have color palettes kind of already set up for you that show really good matching or contrasting colors that go well together. I see some folks taking notes. Hold on. Thinking about logos. So university marketing has Michigan Tech's logos and branding. They also have very department specific ones. Don't forget though to ask your partner institutions or funders or anybody else if they also need to have logos added to your poster or handouts that accompany your poster. Generally, especially when you're funding considerations, you want to have not only the logo on the bottom of your poster, but you would also put it on any accompanying information like a handout or a QR code card. Michigan Tech has a couple of printing options that are a little bit cheaper than going out to the general community, though there are options out in the general community. I did not list them here. The library on the second floor has a self-service large format printer. It's pretty inexpensive to use. My colleague John would encourage folks to double check the scale before you print, making sure that if you use, say for example, PowerPoint, that you set your slide up before starting the design, because the slides are automatically sized to like 8.5 by 11. So size them to what you need before putting your stuff on and before trying to print. Because if you try to print a smaller one, it doesn't work. And then there are directions on, so the print stations are located next to the Recce Bridge. There are directions near that print station that tell you the type of files that you can print from our printers. IT also does some printing where you would submit their file and then they will print, but the cost varies and it doesn't give a clear timeline online. At least with the library, you have access to do it yourself because it is in the 24-hour section. And so we do have a little bit of time for questions, but if you do need any additional help with your poster session or design, you want to talk about layout, you can pick my brain now. That's fine. I'm here for you. You can check out our library guide. The link is listed here. Also easily findable if you go to the library's homepage. On the green bar, select guides, type in research paper or poster, sorry, and it should come up. Or come back and visit us when you feel ready. You can chat us or send us an email. All right, thanks, guys.